Understanding context, so how environmental, cultural, economical, etc., all these factors might influence health. And finally, understanding interaction, so how the various actors involved in different public health activities interact with each other. So these are the main dimensions of qualitative methods. Now, let's try and compare qualitative with quantitative research. So what are the basic differences? Now, in terms of the purpose, so the purpose of qualitative research, for example, is to gain an understanding of a situation and providing insight into a particular practice. So it's in-depth insight into something and trying to understand it. However, quantitative is actually quantifying data and trying to measure magnitude. So how widespread is a particular practice, for example? When we come to comparing data, qualitative is in-depth explanatory data from a small sample, while the quantitative is wide breadth of data from large statistically representative samples. So for quantitative, you have a larger sample size and you're trying to collect the data from that. In terms of analysis, so for the qualitative, it's non-statistical compared to the quantitative, which is statistical. So the qualitative, you're trying to draw patterns or theories or concepts and insights into something, while for the quantitative, you're testing a hypothesis or using data to support the conclusion. In terms of the results or the outcomes of these two different research methods, so for the qualitative, the findings are not conclusive and cannot be used to make generalization. However, for the quantitative, there's numerical aggregation in summaries, and it's used to recommend a final course of action. So it could be more generalized. So what are the key features in qualitative research? So number one, relatively open-ended exploratory research design. Okay. Number two, relatively unstructured or semi-structured data collection. So how do we achieve that? We can achieve that through interviews, for example. So participants talk in their own terms about matters relevant to the research. Observations, so recorded in field note descriptions, transcriptions and audio-video recording, so you actually record the participants outlaying their experiences, and finally written documents of various kinds. So these are the key features in qualitative research. Now, qualitative research designs, there are several designs, so I'll just be briefly touching on some of them, and some of the names you might come across in the literature, so just to simplify them. So the first qualitative research design that we're going to be mentioning is the grounded theory, and that's when a new theory about a phenomena is achieved. So it's going beyond adding to the existing body of knowledge. You're actually trying to develop a theory grounded on data. Our second research design is ethnography. So that's a type of qualitative research that gathers observations and studies people in their own environment through face-to-face interviews, for example. Phenomenology, and that's the understanding and describing of a specific phenomena in depth. So, for example, you're trying to understand the experience of COVID-19 care in depth. Case study, so in-depth investigation of a single or small number of units at a point in time. So, for example, evaluating a particular service. Participatory action research, or PAR, and that involves researchers and participants working together to understand a problematic situation and try and change that for the better. Now, again, going back to comparing qualitative and quantitative in terms of analytic approaches. So in terms of the research question, quantitative has a fixed or a focused research question, while the qualitative has a broader, flexible research question. For the quantitative, the time dimension is slower. For the qualitative, it's rapid to slower. The confounding factors or the variables in the quantitative are controlled during the design and during the analysis, while for the qualitative, it's searched within the field. The hierarchy of phases, for the quantitative, it's linear. So remember, for the quantitative, for example, you have case-based studies at the base of your hierarchy phases and going up towards the RCTs or randomized controlled studies. However, for the qualitative, the hierarchy is more circular, so your question is circular. You're going round in circles, trying to achieve what you need, what the data you need is. And finally, the expected outcome. So for quantitative, it's identified in advance compared to for the qualitative, it's usually not predefined. It actually emerges through your research. Now, comparing them both in terms of data collection method. So for the quantitative, for example, the sampling is actually a random sampling. However, for the qualitative, you have open-ended and less structured protocols. You're more flexible with your sampling. The tools that are used in quantitative, they are more structured, so structured data collection instruments. As opposed to for the qualitative, it depends on the interactive interviews. So you can have face-to-face and individual interviews, for example. In terms of results, quantitative, it produces results that are generalized, compared and summarized. However, for the qualitative, it produces results that give meanings, experiences, views of participants. So that's just a brief comparison between them in terms of data collection. And finally, the important concepts in designing qualitative research. So first of all, what are the important concepts? Number one, natural setting. So for the data, it's actually collected in the participant's natural environment. Okay, so you're conducting, for example, face-to-face individual interviews in the participant's natural environment. Holism as well. So you're talking more about magnitude rather than the sum, like you do for the quantitative. Human as a research instrument. So the researcher is in the center of this research. They need to be a good listener. They need to interact. They need to be flexible. So you have a human as a research instrument. Number four, emergent design. So the design actually emerges more and more through your research while you're actually conducting your research. And then finally, one of the important concepts is saturation or redundancy. So when is enough enough? When do you reach saturation? So how many participants do you interview? So once you've had a response or an answer to your research questions, that's when you say, okay, now I have enough data, I can stop. You don't need to have a big sample size, small sample size would be sufficient. So thank you for listening to this part, and we can now move to our polling. So a few questions.
Okay, so good evening, everyone. I'm gonna read the questions and the answers, and you have about 60 seconds to answer. So the first question is, compared to quantitative analytic approaches, qualitative approaches have predefined outcomes. B, a fixed research question. C, usually a circular hierarchy of phases. D, statistical data, usually in the form of tabulation. So if you can answer the question. Dr. Zakaria, the second question. Okay, so the majority has answered C, usually a circular hierarchy, which is the correct answer. So well done.
Yeah, correct. So it's, as I mentioned earlier, it's usually a circular hierarchy. Yeah. Thank you, Dr.
Okay, so the second question is, which of the following is not an accepted approach when collecting data in qualitative research? A, observing and recording human behaviors. B, focus groups. 3, telephone interviews. And D, using closed-ended question. So here is, which of the following is not an accepted approach when collecting data in qualitative research?
Okay, so we need 10 seconds to collate the answers, and then I'll make the results available to you on the screen.
Okay, so I think the majority have also answered this question correctly, as the others are all part of the data, the collection of qualitative data. So D is the correct answer. Okay, the third and last question here is, what is qualitative research, or qualitative research should not be used in combination with quantitative research method? B, often measures a single criterion outcome. C, favors lab-based study design. Or D, allows design to emerge during the study. Okay, again, the majority has answered this correctly, which is D, allowing designs to emerge during the study, whereas the other ones, so the first one should not be used in combination with quantitative. Actually, we do have mixed research methods where we can use quantitative and qualitative research, and that's a different part or a different approach in research. And the other ones are more with quantitative. So the correct answer is D. Thank you for answering these questions, and I'll hand the mic to Dr. Derek.
Thank you, Dr. Ala. If I could have control, that's great. So just bear with me, I will just share the screen. Well, good evening, everyone. My name's Derek, and I'm Professor in Clinical Pharmacy and Practice. I started off my career very much in a scientific training doing quantitative research, and I've sort of moved more into qualitative and now carry out quantitative and qualitative, sometimes separately in studies and sometimes in combination in mixed method. And I think if a lot of the audience have come from a quantitative scientific training, it's easy to look at qualitative research as being very simple. But actually, I always say to people, it's actually easy to do badly, and it's really, really difficult to do well. But it's really important, and even as part of a randomized controlled trial that will give us definitive results of whether treatment A is better than treatment B, what it won't necessarily do is tell us why. And the qualitative data, qualitative research, will tell us a lot about experiences, views, meaning of different interventions, innovations to individual people. So qualitative research is really its own research paradigm, a research area, but often used in combination with quantitative to give meaning to that as well. I'm going to take you through some of the key concepts that I really learned over time as being really fundamental in qualitative research and making it very different to quantitative research. So that's things like the sampling that we do, how we work out how many people we need, and the fact we can't actually work it out, and this thing called research trustworthiness as well, because it's really easy to influence qualitative research in a negative way and affect the result we get. Qualitative research is also filled with lots of terms that are really difficult terms, but when you actually look at them, when you look at what's phenomenology, all it really means is that we're researching experiences of something. So sometimes forget about the term and focus on what's underneath the term. But one of the key things we need to think about is who are we going to include in qualitative research, and how many of them do I need, and where do I get them? And it's very, very different to quantitative in terms of sampling and sample size. So you have to remember qualitative research. So we're not going to use 2,000 people. Statistical analysis is not relevant at all in qualitative research. And I've had scientists say to me in qualitative research, what was the power of the study? Which is not a relevant question at all. It just shows a complete lack of understanding of what we're doing in qualitative research. So we can't statistically calculate a sample size. As Dr. Ala said a minute ago, we're not trying to make any generalization or extrapolate the data anywhere else. The findings of qualitative research apply to the people that we study. Now, we might try and think about transferring them to other people in other groups, and I'm going to speak about that in a minute, but they really do just apply to those people we study. So the sample sizes are much, much smaller, and we use different approach called non-probability sampling. And if you get any questions that you want asked, just load them on the chat screen for later. Now, non-probability sampling, the likelihood of being drawn out of a sample and used in a study is unknown. So it's not like random sampling. So in a random sample, everyone in a population has got an equal chance of being sampled, being included in the study. And as I just said, qualitative research is filled with these terms that are really scary. And when you look at the textbooks around the terms for sampling in qualitative research, you get this huge array of scary terms like extreme or deviant cases and intensity sampling and critical case sampling. But when you actually look at what it means, there's a lot of common sense and it's not as complex as things. There's two main approaches that we use that I'm going to speak about just in a little bit more detail. And they're purposive, sometimes called purposeful, or snowball, which is also referred to as chain sampling. And if we look at the first one, so purposive sampling or purposeful sampling, we're actually sampling people for a purpose. So that word actually tells us what we're doing. And that little diagram of the hand reaching in, that hand has almost worked out who it wants to research, who it wants to include in the sample of participants, and has chosen that person deliberately. So we are looking at people who've got the characteristics we're looking for that are going to generate the data that's most valuable to the research. So if we want to research a procedure in hospital that's not working, we might look at people who've complained because they are going to give us the most valuable data about why it's not worked. So we're selecting people for a specific purpose, but it does mean that we need to know something about these people. So I've got an example here. This is a study that we're doing just now. It's actually a mixed method study, but we're looking at the qualitative part of that here. So we're looking in depth at the perspectives of pharmacists and Hamad towards themselves being able to train and prescribe medicine. So the purposive sample, we've had people already fill in an online questionnaire, and as part of that, they to self-rate how ready they were to train and be prescribing medicine. So what we did in the qualitative part that we're doing just now is sample those who are most ready. Who are self-rating as those being most ready to undertake prescribing, because they're going to give us the most valuable information about exploring pharmacist prescribing. If we look at people who filled in the questionnaire and said, I've never ever thought about this, then for us to get more depth on that, it is not really going to be useful to the research aid. So we're looking at those people who said they're really ready to do this, and then within that, we want a range of different clinical specialties. So we want to sample across these different areas and see if there are differences in people working in, say, mental health or cardiovascular. But what we're doing is selecting people for a specific purpose. The other main approach that we use is called snowball or chain sampling. And you can see in the picture on the right-hand side of the slide is the snowball getting bigger and bigger and bigger as it gets down the hill. And here, it's really, we're speaking about very hard to reach groups. So in the previous example, the pharmacists that filled in questionnaires, we can identify them, we can reach them. But sometimes you want to research a group that's actually really difficult to identify, so really difficult to find. So there's no what's called a sampling frame. We don't know who's everyone that we might include because we don't know who they are. So we can't create it. So what we need to do is find a few people initially and use them to help us identify and recruit other people. And then those people will help identify and recruit other people. So it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. So the sample builds the longer the study continues. At some point we've got to stop, but the people in the study are helping us to identify other people that would be useful to study. Now there's a potential bias in there that we're not in control of who we're sampling and who we're studying, but there's no other way to really do it because we can't identify these people in advance. So there's an example of a study here, which is looking at either illicit drug users, or it might be anything that people are using that they shouldn't really legally be using. So we can't find easily a big list of these people. But if some of them are coming to specialist clinics and presenting, they might be able to help us recruit some other people, make them aware of the study, then they could be invited, consented. It would still be very ethical, but they've helped us identify other people. So the actual sampling is very different in qualitative research. The other thing that's different is the sample size, because again, in quantitative research, you will calculate it. You can calculate the number you need for an RCT, or for a survey, or a cohort study, or any other study design in quantitative research. But here we're trying to get something called saturation of the findings or the themes or the issues. And it's really just themes issues. They're just groups of findings. So what we really want is that they're saturating. So once we've collected data from a certain number of people, done the analysis, and then we recruit some other people, if we keep repeating the analysis and there is nothing new coming out, it looks as though we've got saturation. But you never ever know, because you don't know that if you just included one more person, you'd have got something new. But at some point, you've got to make that decision to stop. So these are the main experiences that we've got about pharmacists prescribing, the main experiences about the illicit drug users and so on. So what we really are trying to do is ensure adequate, necessary, sufficient data to answer our research question. But those terms, adequate, necessary, and sufficient, are really difficult to measure, because how do you know it's adequate, necessary, and sufficient? So as I say, you're really looking for saturation and that nothing new is coming out, and you have to make that decision to stop. But you can see from that the data generation, how we're generating the data. And in qualitative research, you tend not to speak about data collection, because that almost implies the data are sitting there to be collected. It would generate the data. So the data generation and the analysis, they have to go together. You can't sort of, interview 40 people and then start to do the analysis. So should we stop? Do we go on forever? Please help me to decide on this. So it's difficult. And there are different approaches to help us decide on that. And you tend to have sample size of 5, 10, 15, 20, so on. If you've got a qualitative study and it's got a sample size of 200, then it's not a qualitative study. So that's another bit that's really different. And the another bit that's different is this term rigor. So in quantitative research, you really speak about robustness. And we've got things that we can measure in that. We've got concepts of validity. So we look for valid data. If we measure blood pressure, and validity is about correctness, if you're measuring it properly, then that's the correct value. Reliability is about getting consistency of results. So if we measure something again and again and again, and we get the same result, and it's likely to be reliable. In qualitative research, we can't say that something is correct or not. We can't say that somebody's experience, yeah, that answer is correct. So it becomes much, much more complex and much more difficult to control. And that's why I say, qualitative research is very difficult to do well, and it's very easy to do badly. And people who don't ever do qualitative research tend to dismiss it as being very simple. So we've got 4 terms here that we use that I'm going to just spend a few minutes on. So we've got credibility that we use really in terms of in replacement for internal validity. We've got dependability that replaces reliability. We've got transferability rather than external validity, and confirmability rather than objectivity. And please don't get confused or completely muddled by these terms. Remember, I said qualitative research is full of terms. If you sort of ignore the terms and look at below them. And a lot of it makes sense. So we've got this thing, credibility, and that just means do the findings reflect reality? And what we're trying to get here is honesty from the participant. So we need very qualified, experienced qualitative researchers. We need to use really well-established research methods. So we've got well-established methods with people who know what we're doing. And using tactics, I always think this is funny, and I've taken it from other places, to ensure honesty. How do we get honesty? But if I'm being interviewed and I know the purpose of this interview, I'm more likely to give reality, give my real experience. I'm not going to make it up because I think I've been checked. We might use iterative questioning to keep probing, to keep going back to the same issues, to really see that we're getting consistent descriptions of what people think. And this thing called member checking. So once we've actually collected data or generated data, transcribed it, to put it back to the interview to say, does this seem real with what we're doing? Do our findings seem real? Dependability is just really, if we do the same thing again, are we likely to get the same finding? So we need detailed data gathering, as well as our qualified, experienced researchers and well-established methods. And at the side on this slide is this thing called reflexivity, and again, it's on these horrible terms. And this is something that researchers should do. And we're ongoing reflecting on what we are doing to make sure that there is rigor to it and we're not biasing things. So we need to interact with other members in the team to be saying, right, these are the findings that are coming out to the team to make sense. And we need to keep questioning ourselves. We need to look at our own assumptions. I led a lot of the research in Scotland on pharmacist prescribing. I know the answers I want to get from the qualitative research in HAMAD on pharmacist prescribing. I've got huge assumptions, expectations of that data. I need to think about that and how we handle that. And I won't do the focus groups that we're going to run, because I know that from that reflexivity, I could really influence that data. And the other bit's confirmability. Now, this is difficult as well, to make sure that the findings are the result of the experience and ideas of the informants and not the researcher. So that's a bit about what I was just saying around reflexivity, me admitting my own predisposition about pharmacist prescribing. I'm going to really want that data to be supportive. But we've all got bias. If you're doing research, say, on asthma, and we bring in a pure researcher to look at that, who's not a health professional, they're likely to have heard of asthma, might have a friend with asthma, might have a relative with asthma. So we've all got these predispositions, but we need to admit them and be aware of them. And transferability is really about, can we transfer the findings to other populations, other hospitals, other countries, other health systems? And that's really about the researchers providing a lot of contextual information to allow the reader to decide it. So we need to have what's called thick description within the research report. And just at the bottom of the slide, it's hidden there in the sort of brown bit at the bottom, is the ethical considerations of that. Because the more and more descriptions that we give of the setting, of the health service, of the participant, they can start to be identified. So we have to balance that thick description with protecting the anonymity of the people involved in the research. So those are just some bits. I'll go to the previous slide. Some bits where qualitative research is very, very different to quantitative. And hopefully I'm just starting to give you a bit of an idea about some of the complexities within qualitative research. So I'm going to stop sharing the screen and we can go to some of these polling questions.
Okay, so we have 3 questions here. The first question is, the size of a sample for qualitative studies is it calculated based on confidence intervals? B, usually large? C, usually determined by the point of saturation of themes? And D, best decided by the amount of time available? And I think there is a key word here. These questions. Okay, so the majority have answered, 13 have answered C, which is, so the key word here is saturation. I think with qualitative research, you continue doing it until you reach that moment or that point of saturation. It could be 5 interviews, it could be 10, 15. I think as long as you're hearing data, you would continue until you reach that point. Okay, so second question. Which of the following is an accepted approach to sampling in qualitative research? A, random sampling. B, stratified random sampling. C, systematic sampling, or D, purposive sampling? So I know maybe for some people these are quite confusing words, but Dr. Derek has given you the hint for this one. Okay, so the majority have answered this question correctly. So again, with purposive sampling, it's referring to this judgmental or expert sample. So yes, for those who are not answering, do give it a try. We will not know who you are.
Okay, now I will hand on to Prof. Walid.
Thank you, Derek. Welcome all to this series of qualitative research. My colleagues have highlighted some of the features and characteristics that characterize qualitative research and some of the issues of rigor of qualitative research. I'll be talking more about the criteria for reporting. So when we read a qualitative article, what do we look for? Obviously, we read a lot of research, and sometimes we believe it all, or we believe part of it, or we don't believe any of it. It really depends on what the researchers have told us about what they have done. So one of the things when reading a qualitative research article, there would be things to look for, so you understand more about the design and what was done, and what issues of rigor were followed. And then perhaps you can make up your own mind on deciding whether or how much of that you will take on board. So things of what or how should I report? And
Dr. Walid,
yes,
if you can share your slides with us, please.
oh, I thought I just did this, but yes,
That's fine, thank you.
right. Maybe then I should start here then. Sorry about this. I'm Professor Walid Al-Ansari. I'm a senior consultant in surgery at HMC. I love qualitative methods. I use them frequently, either on their own or together with quantitative methods. What we'll be looking at today is looking at issues of the criteria when we read qualitative research articles. So we come to key questions of what or how should I report, and what, in the same manner, what did others report in the qualitative research article that I'm reading. There is something known as the Consolidated criteria for reporting qualitative studies, known as the CORAC, that comprises of 32 item checklists. It could be used for interviews and focus groups, and it comprises 3 domains. The first set of domain is a set of questions that I ask myself, have the authors or investigators reported this? has to do with research team and reflexivity. The second domain is a set of questions having to do with study design. And the third domain has to do with the analysis. So one of the things I would ask myself, did they tell us about which of the authors conducted the interviews or the focus groups, for example? Is it stated what are the researchers' credentials? What is their occupation at the time of the study? What was the researcher, male or female, and their experience or training? Things so that the reader can build up his or her own opinion about the investigators in this study. Another set of questions, and all this has to do with domain one, which is the research team and the reflexivity, are the personal relationships with participants. So have relations been established? Was there a relationship prior to the study? We want to know whether the researcher has been involved with the subjects that the research is involving them, whether this has happened or not, and what kind of relationship. Is it there to know whether they are, for example, well aware of the context where things are happening, etc., or participant knowledge of the interviewer, which is the opposite really. Did the participants know about the researcher, the reasons for doing the research? What is the interviewer characteristics? What characteristics were reported about the interviewer or the facilitator? So we understand if there was any bias, any luggage or baggage that are brought into the research, if you like, any assumptions, or what are the reasons and interests in the research topic. Again, this is the first domain, which is research team and reflexivity. We also look at the issues regarding to study design, which is the second domain of the COREC 32 item checklist. We try to look at the methodological orientation and the theory. And I think my colleagues have touched upon these. What are the orientation and methodological orientation stated to underpin? Was it discourse analysis, grounded theory, ethnography, phenomenology, content analysis? Has this been explicitly stated in the paper? Again, Professor Derek just touched upon participants. I would like also, when I read a qualitative paper, to be informed by the investigators about what sampling they used, how were participants selected, what was their method of approach, how were these participants approached, was it face-to-face, telephone, email, or just by mail? What was the sample size? Not that many or less, but what were the numbers of actually participants who were in the study? And issues of non-participations. How many people refused to participate or dropped out? And what are the reasons? Always be aware that when you're researching something, it's usually, well, it happens a lot of times that people who do not have the characteristic are more forthcoming to participate. Let's say you're doing interviews about smoking. You will find that a lot of non-smokers come forward to participate in your research, and they're very proud that they are not non-smokers. So non-participation is usually a conscious choice. You would want to understand why people are non-participating and what are the reasons, if this is stated in the article. Another thing that we need to look at is the setting. Where was the data collections? And anyone else besides the participants and the researcher were actually present in the interviews or the focus groups. The description of the sample. What are the important characteristics of the sample? A bit about demography would help the reader understand who these participants are, some of the data, and of course the date and duration when this research happened. I would also be looking as a reader that in an article that has been published to find information about the data collection. Was there an interview guide used, something to prompt the questions? Was it pilot testing? Was there repeat interviews? For example, I could interview you and maybe in the analysis I find that there was a couple of things I did not understand, so I come back to you again and ask. Was it audio recorded or video recorded? This should be also stated. Any field notes that the investigator was taking while in the field, because not everything could be captured in an audio recording, for example. What was the duration of the interviews or the focus groups? And was data saturation discussed in the article? Have the investigators told us that they sampled until saturation or otherwise? And anything about transcripts return? Maybe when I get the data or I get the audio recording, I transcribe the data and I read it. And sometimes I could take these transcripts and go back to the interviewee and give them these transcripts and tell them, is this an accurate account of the interview that we had? So it gives more confirmability and trust in that our understanding is the same. Again, with domain 3, there are other things that I would look for. Things about data analysis. Has this been reported? How many people coded the data, for example? Was it one person? Then maybe it's a little bit more consistent. Or were there many people coding the data? How was the coding tree and a description of it? How were the themes identified? Were they in advance or really coming out organically, very inductive from the data? Was it done by hand or was software used, and which software was used, etc.? And participant checking, did participants provide feedback on the findings? Here are my findings. I could go back to the interviewees and share these findings and I see what their opinions are. Other things also that I would look for would be some quotations, and I think this is quite critical in qualitative research, and it's also characteristics of qualitative research, and it's part of the beauty of qualitative research that you hear voices, and you can read the voices verbatim of the participants, untouched, as they were said in the focus group or the interview. So I would ask myself, have these investigators actually presented some of the quotations for the reader to get a first-hand feel of what this interviewees actually said? Are the data findings consistent? Or is there a consistency between the data that is presented and the quotations and the actual themes that the investigators claim that here are the themes? Are the major themes actually clear and grounded or presented in the findings that have been dished out by the investigators? And clarity also of the minor themes. Is there a description of diverse cases or cases that are not typical, or if you like to use the word outliers, as we would in quantitative research, it's also things that I would be looking for. Has this been reported or not? So as you can see, there is really a lot of things that when reading a piece of qualitative research, I would be looking for all this to understand the context, to understand where the researcher is coming from, to understand who the participants are, to understand the process. How did this happen? When, where, how was the sampling? How did the data analysis go about? How were the themes derived? Am I seeing enough quotes that would tell me that this is really the name of the theme that the coding and the coders have found to emerge from the data? I ask all myself these questions when I'm reading a qualitative piece of research. I'd just like to spend the last few minutes in giving you perhaps live examples of qualitative research that has been done, and to try to illustrate some, not all, of the issues we talked about. This is a study that was qualitative and quantitative. As you can see, there was a survey of so many people, but I also undertook 46 interviews. This was in South Africa just after the elections. And I would like to show you what emerged from the 46 semi-structures interviews. And I was asking then about community partnerships. I was asking about the leadership skills. Please don't panic. This is a simple diagram, and I'm sure when you start doing qualitative research, you will have things like that. As you can see, this other between quotes is things that people told me exactly in their own words. I started grouping these things from various participants, and I called it these are themes. So actually things are going from the outside to the inside. I was researching leadership. Someone told me this, another person told me this, in the middle of their interview, I have these quotes, and I started grouping these quotes. I said, this tells me about communication. You know, participant 5 and participant 7, these words tell me about legitimacy. Participant 21, it seems these words, to me, they look like the openness of the leadership, and so on. And I started having sub-themes, and these sub-themes pour into a bigger theme, which is visibility, openness, and legitimacy. The same here, quotations, and these quotations poured into a theme which I called leadership features, characteristics, styles, and attitudes. Another theme here, people have told me this, or this, or this, and I found that this has to do with consultation, this has to do with clarity, this has to do, it seems, with support, this has to be to do with self-focus or benefits. This names you coin, the researcher coins these terms. These are themes based or sub-themes based on the quotations, and you asking yourself, what is this quotes? What are these things that they're telling me? What do they mean? And then these sub-themes pour into a theme which is management and procedures, and you can then see that these 1, 2, 3, and 4 are all the themes that converge under leadership. The fourth one here was the consequence of a lack of appropriate leadership, and I had people telling me, if leadership was not inappropriate, this can cause conflict, or people telling me she was afraid to talk, or they were telling me the director uses influential groups, or people thought they could be rubber stamping, or people thought they could not investigate particular things because they are told, no, this is none of your business. And to me, it was all issues that looked like there are consequences of the lack of appropriate leadership. This is how your diagram would normally look when you are building data and organically from quotes into sub-themes into themes. So, yep.
We have one question. So regarding the labeling or the coding or the naming these themes or sub-themes, is this a process that you did independently, or was there a consensus amongst multiple members of the research team?
Yes, I think this is a very nice question. It depends whether you are doing this research alone as a single investigator or part of a team. If it's part of a team, it's always, of course, by consensus. You discuss with the members of the team, and you come out with the best wording to the best of your ability of your sub themes and your themes. In my case, I was the only investigator. This was a study I undertook on my own in very remote parts in South Africa, directly after the elections, really in the middle of nowhere, sometimes 40 kilometers away from the nearest tar road, and at many times drinking rainwater so I was alone in the field. Data was being analyzed in the field, and I think this is a lovely question, because it tells you then how objective you need to be. And it links up with what previous speakers were talking about, our own biases, our own baggage that we carry along, and we need to really take care of this when we are doing qualitative research. So you need to be as neutral as possible when you are looking at these and coding, giving them terms, because you coined these, and I think you really need to revise with yourself. Am I neutral here, or am I biased here? Am I carrying some of my own thoughts that I came with even before the research start, to be able to have terms and codes that directly reflect the data? And as long as you put in your publication or in your report the quote and what you termed it and the sub-theme or theme, then this is what we're talking about. Then you're giving the reader the opportunity to see, does this quote actually fit under what he called consultation? You see, the reader becomes your judge. which then gives an issue of objectivity, if you like, for the reader to be able to trust this data. So you provide the quotes of the verbatim of actually what people have said, so your reader can judge. I hope I've answered the question, because I know I am nearly close to my time here. So there we go. Thanks again, and over to you, Zach.
Okay, before you leave, we just have a few two polling questions based on your content. So I'll release the first one now.
Okay, so the question here is the minimum sample size qualitative interviewing is A, 30, B, 31, C, 60, or D, it's really hard to say. Okay, so the majority have answered this correctly, 10, so it's actually hard to say. Okay, the second question. Respondent validation is the process by which A, the validity of an interview schedule can be measured, B, researchers ask their participant to comment on an account of the findings, C, the problem of low response rate to a survey can be overcome, D, participant collaborate with researcher to design the research. Okay, so some 7 answered B, answered B. And the correct answer here is researchers ask their participant to comment on an account of the finding. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'll stop sharing now my screen. Over to you, Zach.
Thank you very much, Dr. Walid. Okay, so now I think we have some time for to look at an example study that we will be critiquing. Dr. Alak, can I hand the microphone over to yourself?
Yep, thank you, Zach. So I will start sharing. Okay, so now we will start an activity, and we will actually try and critically appraise an article. So this is the article that we have chosen. Key stakeholders' views on the potential implementation of pharmacist prescribing, a qualitative investigation. So let's try and think together how we can critically appraise this, thinking back at the checklist that my colleague, Prof. Waleed, just went through. So I have a screenshot of the methods from this article, and you can see it's nicely been divided into sections. So study design, settings, inclusion and exclusion, sampling and sample size. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to link this now with the checklist and make sure that, yes, you know, most of the information is available. Are there any gaps? So we're trying to critically appraise this. However, when you go through the checklist, the sequence of that is not necessarily the same sequence as you find things in the article. So you might find something in the study design, but something else could be mentioned later on in the sample size, for example, or even in the results, you might find an answer to your question. So let's look together. So we have the study design bit now, and what we've done is we've extracted some of the checklist points, as you can see at the bottom there. So the study design paragraph was stating that a qualitative approach was selected in an attempt to obtain in-depth perspectives, key stakeholders. Semi-structured interviews were chosen over focus groups for several reasons, including the desire to obtain individual rather than collective views, and the logistical difficulties of scheduling focus groups with high-profile participants. So let's look together at the checklist. Which one do we think we can find so far from that study design? So sampling, how were participants selected? No, not yet. We can't find it in this paragraph. Method of approach. So it's not how we approach the candidates. However, they have mentioned that it was done through interviews rather than focus groups, and they've written, they've stated the reason for that. Sample size, that was not mentioned yet. We might find it elsewhere. And the non-participation, so how many people refused to participate and what the reason was. So again, that wasn't mentioned. So far, we managed to find the approach, the design, which is using the semi-structured interviews. Now let's see if we can find more information elsewhere. So as I mentioned before, there are different parts within that paper. So there's the data generation, analysis, ethical consideration, and results. So, and even within the results, you might find some of the information for the checklist. So sampling and sample size. So if we so they've stated that the sampling frame included all individuals meeting the inclusion and exclusion criteria. So the names and contact details were collated using their professional networks. Okay. Purposive sampling, representing diversity of years experience, etc., was adopted. This allowed identifying and approaching those individuals most likely to contribute. But also, it says, in addition, snowball sampling was also used to ensure that no key individuals have been omitted. So let's look down now at the checklist again and just think about the sampling. So how were the participants selected? Was that mentioned? Okay, yeah. So the names and contact details were collated, and they were approached using professional networks. So that was the selection. And what do you think? Did they use purposive, Snowball? Was that mentioned, sampling? Again, yes, they did mention that they used both the purposive sampling and the Snowball technique. So the method of,
Sorry, Dr. Alat. I'll just ask respondents if you can, when you're putting your comments in the chat, you just select everybody so everybody can see your comments. Because at the moment, I think it's only me that's reading your comments. So the participants so far, they've said that participants were recruited using purposive and Snowball sampling.
Yes, correct. So that was clearly outlined in the paper, and the method of approach, how they approached them, obviously through professional networks. Was it face-to-face, etc.? That was mentioned earlier when they had semi-structured interviews. Sample size, is that mentioned so far? So how many participants were in the study? So far, we can't identify the sample size from this paragraph. However, it might be somewhere else. Non-participation, so how many people refused to participate? Okay, yeah, that's not mentioned so far. Now, with the sample size, what they have mentioned so far in this paragraph, yes, correct. Someone's saying it was not discussed. So far, what they've mentioned in this paragraph is recruitment continued to the likely point of data saturation. So remember what Prof. Derek mentioned earlier about the data saturation. So they did say that the point at which no new themes have emerged, but they did not specify yet the exact number. For example, how many interviews they conducted and how many participants were included in the study. So moving on to another paragraph. So the semi-structured interview schedule was drawn from a comprehensive literature review, an umbrella review of systematic reviews on non-medical prescribing, and the systematic review of views and experience conducted by the research team, etc. Okay, so let's have a few seconds just to read through that, and if you can try to check and map that with the checklist so far.
Dr. Alat, there's a request. Sorry, Dr. Alat, there's a request just to slow down a little bit so we can have a chance to read the content and the questions too.
Okay. So I'll leave this up there for a few seconds for people to have a chance to read. Okay. So yes, I can see some comments starting to come through. It was piloted, correct. So the first point in that checklist, was it pilot tested? Yes, it was. Number 17. And were questions, prompts, guides provided by the authors? Yes, there was, because it states, as you can see, the last sentence there, an overview of the interview schedule questions and alignment to the research question are presented in table 1. So they had a table where they actually presented all the questions. Yep, so there's no information yet about the repeat interviews, where they carried out or not, and if yes, how many. Number 19, yep, there was no information so far about audio-visual recording. And as I mentioned earlier, I guess what you need to do normally with an article like this is scan through it first, read the whole thing, and then go back and try and critically appraise it, because only once you've read all of it, you can then take some information from here and there. Okay, so duration, data saturation, that was not, was that covered? Okay, not yet. Okay, so they did say earlier that they tried to reach a point, obviously, where they, you know, enough is enough, and they have all their data. So saturation was discussed. So is everyone happy with this paragraph? Shall I move on? Okay, thank you. So the next paragraph, data generation. So now they are stating that from April, etc. So I'll give you a few seconds to read through that, and then we can look together at the checklist. Okay, so I can start to see some comments coming through. Okay, yeah. Okay, yep, so I can see some comments coming through. So you're stating face-to-face interviews are mentioned, number 19, 20, 21, 23 from the checklist. So you can see that now that we have reached this paragraph about data generation, we've started to gain more and more information about the way this qualitative research has been conducted. So they've stated previously that there was a pilot, and transcripts were returned as well. So that's the last point that was covered. Yeah, it was saying that interviews were digitally audio recorded and transcribed. So that point is covered. The duration and the time as well. So interviews of approximately 45 to 60 minutes. Okay. So what do you think are we missing so far? data saturation? Okay, so now we can have Prof. Derek on board with us because we are actually critically appraising one of his articles. So you can now step in and defend your article, Prof. Derek.
Writing as well, you are limited by the word count in the papers. But one thing I do is look out the checklists, and before submitting the paper and writing the paper, use the checklist to help guide how the paper will be written. And it's interesting, some journals require you to submit a checklist completed, telling you on which page of your manuscript you're covering all the different criteria as part of the submission process. And that will go out to reviewers as well. So these checklists are being used more and more. The saturation, I can see people are saying isn't yet covered. That actually came through in the results. So because when we're writing the method, we can say that we were aiming for saturation, but as you plan it, you don't know that you've achieved it. So gaining saturation or achieving saturation, or you think you've achieved saturation, is really a result of the study. So that would go in there. And as Dr. Alice said, these checklists, although they're really comprehensive, they're not necessarily in order. So it doesn't matter that you don't cover them point after point, but that you really are referring to them somewhere in the paper. And they've certainly helped me when I'm particularly writing qualitative research. We do now put much more emphasis on describing who the researchers were, the training, the expertise in qualitative research, and other steps really around credibility, dependability, sending the transcripts back, offering the respondents, the participants, a chance to review the transcripts, maybe to comment on the findings as well. So it's certainly altered how I and the people I work with have done qualitative research. You can actually see there in the results on the screen, it says data saturation was deemed to have been achieved. Because remember, you don't know. You don't know that you've got data saturation. You don't know that the next person isn't going to say something different. And that's why as well, in mixed methods research is particularly valuable because the qualitative research will tell us the main themes, the issues. The quantitative research can quantify that. So sometimes when we're using those two together, we might do the quantitative first, which will count things, it'll correlate, it will test statistical hypotheses, and then the qualitative will allow us to go in depth to try and get some explanation of the findings. Or you might do it the other way around. So if you're going to develop a questionnaire and there's no literature, there's no theory to help you develop that questionnaire, then you might do the qualitative research first. And that would be called content setting. It will help you actually develop the key themes, the key important issues, to then develop the content for your questionnaire. So sometimes using the two together is much more useful. It's almost synergistic of using the 2 points separately. But if there's anything else anybody wants to ask about that paper, please bring it up. And I'm quite happy for you to bring out limitations in the study. The thing is, every study's got limitations. It doesn't matter how much time and how much money you've got, you're always going to get studies with limitations. And it's good when you're writing papers for you to actually tell the journal and the reviewers those limitations. Don't wait for the reviewers to tell you, because they will find them. So it's better for you to put them up front and really defend them and show that you're aware of those limitations.
There is one comment, Professor Derek, and that's around saturation and how and the challenges in identifying when you've reached saturation. I mean, you because it does sort of like imply that you are undertaking your data analysis as you are conducting your interviews or whichever you're
ideally that is the ideal. But sometimes with logistics, if you're interviewing really busy people, and you happen to have 3 interviews scheduled in one day, you can't be transcribing and analysing each one before you go back to interview the next one. But what you shouldn't be doing is wait until you've done a big number of interviews and then start analysing. So the other thing in qualitative research is that your interview schedule or your focus group topic guide should be quite dynamic. And something that few people are raising in interviews should then come into your next set of questioning, because that's maybe an issue that you hadn't thought. When you developed your interview schedule and looked at the literature and any theories to help you do that, it just didn't appear. But if this is becoming an issue, it's something that then brings in. So there's lots of reasons to try and do contemporaneous data generation, transcribing, analysing, and keep going. But in practice, it doesn't always work out quite that way. There's really very little evidence to help guide the number that you need to get saturation. There is an approach that was published in a pain journal, pain study that was done in Scotland a few years ago, trying to identify, using different approaches, when to stop doing interviews. And they came up with this 10+3 approach, it's called. And if anybody's really interested, I can give you the reference for it. And what they recommended was to set an initial sample size, which is quite arbitrary. And in that study, they set 10. They then did all of the analysis. They then did another 3 interviews, analysed the data from those 3, and then compared the themes from those 3 to the 10. Now, if there was nothing new, they then stopped. If there was something new, they then kept doing another 1 interview and looking at the last 3 interviews and the analysis from that for new things. So they kept then doing another one, another one, another one, another one, until there was a point of almost no return that nothing new was coming through. But it is very, very arbitrary in terms of the qualitative interviewing. Now, somebody just asked, could I tell them briefly again the steps of doing a qualitative study? Now, that could be huge. It depends what you want. So in a way, you need to justify and select the methodology. So is this something that you are going to do? Are you trying to derive a new theory? Are you going to use grounded theory? Now, in applied healthcare, we tend to use theories that are already there. They're usual for us to develop that. So we would think about the methodology. Now, for us, it's usually phenomenology, because we're usually going there to just understand and describe an experience that people have got. Then to select the actual method of data generation, so it can be focus groups, interviews, observation, collection of data from documentary sources. And again, sometimes it'll be logistics that will help you with that. Then it's thinking about the inclusion and exclusion criteria. So who are you going to include, who you're not going to include? What's your sampling approach? So that's also one part of preparation. You then need to prepare your actual data generation tool. And actually, I should say, please come back next week when we're looking at conducting qualitative research as a CPD session. And then think about developing your data generation tool, your semi-structured interview schedule, your focus group topic guide, how you're going to identify the main areas to question, and previous research will help you there. Thinking about theory, so if you're doing research and implementation, you might use implementation theory. If it's around behaviour, you might use behavioural theory. You then want that data collection, data generation tool reviewed for credibility, so who's going to look at it? Are you going to do a pilot and then start to actually generate the data? But within all of that, you want to look at all the steps of trustworthiness. So who are the researchers? Are they trained? Are they qualified to do qualitative research? If not, can we train them? Can we quality assure what's going on there? So with PhD students who've done interviews, I've been listening to every interview, because they often have had training, they're not very experienced in doing it. And, interview data generation, it's like trying to get inside somebody's head, whether it's in focus groups and interviews. You need to keep probing and probing, really just asking, but why? Can you tell us more about that? Can you give us more explanation. You know, we really need the depth of why people think their experience was in a certain way, why they hold a certain view, and things like that. And then start to think about planning the analysis as well. How are we going to transcribe it? How are we going to quality assure the transcribing? And that's where the checklist, the correct checklist, is really, really useful, because if you go through every single step of that as part of your planning, it does make it much easier. As I say, qualitative research, for people who don't do it, in particular lab-based scientists, will look at it and think, oh, you're just speaking to a few people. It's really easy. Anybody could do that. We'll run a focus group. We'll get people in a room together just to speak. And as I say, it's very easy to do badly. It's very difficult to do well. You know, you need to think about, we spoke as well about everybody coming in with biases, but we might come in with power. You know, if I do a focus group with some of my students, I'm in a position of power over them. Is that going to affect how they are going to respond in that focus group setting? So there are lots and lots of dynamics to think about in qualitative research. And I'll send to Dr. Zach the reference for that 10+3 study to let you see that.
Yeah, that's fine, Professor Derek. I'll share that with the participants. Without sort of like duplicating what we're going to cover next week, there has been one question that's been sent to me, and that's the initial coding of data, and what's the best approach to take to that initial coding.
But it depends whether you're going to do it inductively or deductively. I can never remember which one's which. And as I say, that's why I never bother too much about the terms. But one of them, from the research questions, from the theories, you might be able to come up with an outline of coding headings. If you don't do that, you're going to have to start scanning through and reading through the transcripts to work out the coding headings. And those are very dynamic. You know, they will develop and evolve as you keep doing it, you keep adding to it. And then it's really about, once you've got that coding framework, and there's a really good, I can give you another good reference to, it's called the framework approach to data analysis. And again, I'm sure we'll be covering this next week. Dr. Ala from pharmacy will be focusing on data analysis. But in the framework approach, the first step of that is called immersing yourself in the data. And you really need to read the transcripts again and again and again and again until you know them really well. And if you're inexperienced, one way to really immerse yourself in the data is to do your own transcribing, because then by the time you've almost torn your hair out transcribing, you will know that interview transcript really, really well. So you need to immerse yourself in the data, develop a coding framework that at least two people would independently, if you can do it. I know Prof. Walid was saying he was out in the field on his own, so he had to do it himself. But ideally, in terms of rigor, you'd have at least two people independently coding who would then compare the coding that they've got. And if they're not agreeing, you would bring someone else into that coding team as well to then work out the coding, then try and work out the themes within it. And again, Dr. Ala, I'm sure next week we'll be covering, there are various packages that can help you manage the data. The most common one and well known is Nvivo, but you have to be very careful because a lot of people think it's a data analysis, and it's not. It can't do the thematic analysis. It can't do the coding for you. It will help you manage the data, but you need to do the coding of that data. And then once you've got your themes and your codes, it's thinking about selecting the quotes that will really illustrate those themes that you've identified. But it is complex. And actually, YouTube is very, very good. If you go into YouTube and put in thematic analysis, you will see real-life examples. And again, I'm sure we'll have some of that with you next week about how to actually code a transcript. But it's really difficult. You know, if you're sitting with 15 pages of text and you have to code it and transcribe it, it is not transcribe it, but if you have to code it and theme it, it is really, really difficult to do. It's really time-consuming, really open to bias and different interpretation. The other thing is that the same words on paper can mean opposite things depending on how somebody said it. So if somebody says, "Oh, that's great," in a very positive way, that will just say that is great in a transcript. But if somebody also says, "Yeah, that's great," in a really sarcastic, negative way, on the transcript, that will look exactly the same. So that becomes quite difficult, becomes really difficult doing qualitative analysis. And you need people who are really expert at doing it, got a lot of experience to be part of the team. You've got to learn somehow doing it. But I know when I do it, I get fed up. So I won't do too much in one setting. Otherwise, I start to do it really, really quickly, and I know it's not done very well. The other thing I know is that when I've got a coding framework, say there's 20 things in that coding framework, I'll know the ones at the top really well, and I know that I'm preferentially coding for the codes near the top of the framework. So what's recommended there is that once you've done all your coding, is you reverse your framework so that the code that was number 20 becomes number 1, and then you recode them as well, so that you aren't just focusing on the ones near the top of the framework. They'll say, please come along next week, and you'll get some more insight into that. That's why I say quantitative research is difficult and complex as well, but once you've got your quantitative data in a database and you've quality assured it, and you know what you're doing with statistics, you cannot go wrong. With qualitative data in the data analysis, it can go hugely wrong at that point and become really, really biased. Yeah, and you're right, Mohammed, transcribing can make you lose sense of the messages. So that's it's quite good to listen back as well when you're coding, and not just from the transcript. If you can, you're able to do that.
Okay, great, thank you, Prof. So we've pretty much managed to critically appraise this, and hope you all found this example useful. So just to remind you all about the checklist. So use it as almost like a reference point for you, either when you're trying to critically appraise an article, or even if you yourself are trying to do a particular qualitative research and you're trying to write up everything. Always use this checklist as a reference point for you, and make sure that you have covered most of that information in your own article. So I'm not sure if there are any comments before we end. So I will stop sharing this, but before I stop sharing, please make sure, obviously I think probably Zach will be going over this.
Yep. Okay, so looks like there's any further questions. If you have any questions before we end today's session, then you can post them in the chat. I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes to talk about our upcoming events. So we've been working on our website, and you'll see that we have a new CPD series starting next week. So next week we'll have our final event for our research series. That'll be taking place on Tuesday. And as we mentioned, that will be looking at designing qualitative studies. So it's very much a follow-on to today's session. So I very much encourage you to attend. Following that, we have a 6-part series in antimicrobial stewardship. And this will be a collaborative delivery with HMC staff and QU Health and CNAQ faculty. So it's a weekly event on Monday evenings from 6 till 8 p.m. There is complimentary registration available. However, if you'd like to register for CPD points, then you'll use the paying option that's available on the website. We've received a lot of feedback regarding our CPD series, and it's been positive feedback. And we very much value you taking the time to feedback to us and to communicate to us regarding our activity. So please continue that interaction. We're also issuing a monthly newsletter. So if you're currently not in receipt of that newsletter, then please do email us, and we'll add you to our mailing list. I'm just going to check the chat for one more time, see if anybody has any further questions. Thank you, Dr. Hadi. Okay, so it looks like that's everybody's question there. So, yes, so antimicrobial stewardship is a high priority here within Qatar. So in the new year, we'll be conducting a national needs assessment. That's going to be a multi-institutional initiative to conduct a national assessment for CPD activity, and hopefully that will inform our program going forward. So we look forward to sharing that with you. So I'm just going to take this last couple of minutes to thank our speakers today. Everybody, Dr. Ala and Dr. Ala, both from QU Health, and Professor Derek and Professor Waleed as well. It's been a very interactive session. I think our participants, they very much valued the opportunity to go through a worked example and to really put some of that into some of the content that we discussed today into context. So thank you for bringing it alive to our participants today. We look forward to seeing you all again the same time next week. Okay. Thank you, everybody, and good night. Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you.